Good evening, and welcome to tonight's episode of Prince Hall Think Tank. My name is Brother Dave Gillard, and I have the pleasure of being your host tonight. Brother Caffey is unable to be here. He said that he would take my place at an I Love New York Knicks event, so I told him I would have no issue holding down the show tonight. So tonight's show, we're going to talk about the history of Prince Hall Masonry in Ontario. And as always, the views and opinions that are expressed by us tonight in no way reflect the views and opinions of the lodges and Grand Lodge which we hold membership. Um, and we also have the pleasure of having a special guest tonight, and we're going to get to his introduction. Once again, I'm a proud past master of Mount Pisgah Lodge number 53, located in Columbus, Georgia, where Brandon Durr serves as our worshipful master. And I also have the pleasure of serving as the worshipful grand historian for the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Georgia, where the Honorable Corey D. Shackelford Sr. serves as our 18th most worshipful Grand Master. So now I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Brother Damian Jack.
Good evening to all. I'm pretty sure Brother Caffey is going to get you for that comment. Uh, uh, Brother Damian Jack, proud past master of Paul Drayton Lodge number 7, where worshipful Brother Sean Moy serves as our worshipful master. Our lodge is a constituent lodge under the auspices of the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of North Carolina, where the Honorable Daniel L. D.T. Thompson serves as our 24th most worshipful Grand Master. It is an honor and a pleasure to be with you here this evening. Thank you all for joining us. You are in for a treat, and definitely hope you enjoy the show this evening.
Brother Morgan.
All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is James R. Morgan III, and I am a proud past master of Corinthian Lodge number 18, where Worshipful Master Davian Gregory is currently presiding. I have the honor and pleasure of serving as the Worshipful Grand Historian and Archivist of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia here in our nation's capital, where the Honorable Anthony B. Corbett is presiding as our Most Worshipful Grand Master. I'm thrilled to be back here on the Prince Hall Think Tank once again with my brothers, and of course with a good friend of mine who I'm learning from every time we talk, Past Grandmaster Jessup. Welcome to the show, Brother Gillarm. Would you like me to go straight into his introduction? All right. So for those who don't know who this wonderful brother is, I will be reading to you his bio really quickly, and then Brother Jessup, most worshipful Brother Jessup, will be the next voice that you will hear. So, most worshipful Brother James Jessup was born and raised in Windsor, Ontario. He graduated from St. Clair College in Industrial Engineering Technology and went on to attend the Lawrence Technical University in Michigan. He is the husband of Carmen Jessup and a proud father of Aaliyah and Justin. Most worshipful Brother Jessup is a retired manufacturing engineer after having served for 41 years at the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan, Global Powertrain Manufacturing Engineering. In later years, he helped set up the Global Powertrain Manufacturing Engineering Department's internal internet operations and specialized in engineering online systems for Ford's Global Powertrain engineers and developed the internet applications to maintain all Global Powertrain Manufacturing Engineering's controlled documents. Brother Jessup was raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason on December the 1st, 1984, in American Star Lodge number 4 in Windsor, Ontario. He was elected as Junior Ward in 1987, Senior Ward in 1988, and was elected to serve in a really wonderful year, 1989. That was a really great year. Some other great things happened that year, but we'll talk about that another time. And in 1990, he also served as worship master, so he was like myself, to and through, I hear that. He became a freighter in Wolverine Consistory number 6 in Detroit, Michigan, for the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, where he receives his 32nd degree. He is a noble of is it Meraki or Marachi? Somebody help me out. Tony James is gonna get me. That word's always
Meraki.
It's Meraki. Okay, I apologize to the nobles of Meraki. That word's always tripped me up. Uh, Meraki Temple number 13 in Detroit, Michigan, in 1986. He was appointed as district grand lecturer in 1991. He was appointed as District Deputy Grand Master in the year 1992, and he served in that position until the year 2001. He was elevated to the degree of Grand Inspector General for of the 33rd degree in May of 1999 under the United Supreme Councils of the Northern Jurisdiction, Prince Hall affiliation, in the John Fulton class. He became a companion of the Holy Royal Arch in Detroit Chapter Number 1 in 2002, and he was elected to serve as Junior Grand Warden in 2001, Senior Grand Warden in 2003, Deputy Grand Master in 2005, and presided at the apex of Prince Hall Freemasonry for the jurisdiction of Ontario, having served as Most Worshipful Grand Master in the year 2006, having been elected to serve as the 46th Most Worshipful Grand Master of what is today the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ontario. And he served in that position until 2008. In 2013, he was elected to the position of Grand Historian of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the province of Ontario, and he still currently holds that position as well. He also serves as the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Correspondence, or the CCFC, for the jurisdiction of Ontario. Prince Hall Think Tank family, let's give a PHTT welcome to none other than Most Worshipful Past Grand Master James Jessup. Past Grand Master Jessup, please.
It is truly an honor to be here among the what I call the stalwarts of Masonic research and knowledge, and to bring on this presentation of how Prince Hall Masonry actually got to Canada. It's an area a lot of people don't even realize that we do have Prince Hall Masons up in Canada. Now, this presentation, I will clarify, was predominantly designed for non-Prince Hall Masons. So this first part, I hope, is review for Prince Hall Masons. But at any rate, I always say any discussion on Prince Hall Masonry is not complete without first examining its origins. The Prince Hall Masons have struggled for legitimate recognition from the time a warrant was first received from the Grand Lodge of England, Moderns. All too often, the study of Prince Hall Masonry focuses on the stories of Prince Hall himself. Because of the many falsehoods that were printed about Prince Hall, some have questioned the Prince Hall story in its entirety. To add to the confusion on the history of Prince Hall, in 1903, a Prince Hall Mason, William Grimshaw, wrote a book titled The Official History of Masonry Among Colored People, which included many fabrications about Prince Hall, and these fabrications have been repeated to the present. Many articles have been propagated using these falsehoods, and one only has to go to the internet to this day to still see these fabrications still in print. Now, what we know about Prince Hall, and again, I hope this is just a review for many, but his birthplace and actual date of birth is not known. Those who've actually went to actually study and look for the documentation, nothing is known about Prince Hall until about the age of 14, where he appears to be a slave in the Hall family. Prince Hall himself had often referred to himself as an African, and there is absolutely no reference can be found substantiating the Grimshaw story that he was born in Barbados. He was not a Methodist minister, but he was very active in his church. Now, there are no actual pictures of Prince Hall, but there is a written description by Reverend Dr. Jeremy Benlap, who at the time describes Prince Hall as a tall, lean Negro of great dignity. He always carries himself with the air of one who ruled many. Now, it's interesting, this Dr. Jeremy Benlap also started the Massachusetts Historical Society, and it appears that he knew Prince Hall personally because in other writings I wouldn't say often, but he has referred to Prince Hall and some of his actions, and I'll talk about one of them later. Now, he did not fight in the Revolutionary War. The name was not uncommon at the time. There were actually 3 Prince Halls that have been identified that fought in the Revolutionary War, and they were able to trace those histories, and it was not our Prince Hall. Now, Primus Hall was a Prince Hall Mason, but he was not the son of Prince Hall, nor was he one of the original 15 men who were raised to Irish Lodge number 441. Now, he was a leather tanner by trade, and he was a renowned caterer. It was often stated whenever a well-to-do person wished the best catering in Eastern Massachusetts, he sent word to Prince Hall in Boston. And again, this is where Dr. Jeremy Benlap has often again referred to Prince Hall because he personally sought Prince Hall's catering expertise. Now, we do know Prince Hall was very active within his church. He was very active within the Black community of Boston, instrumental in setting up schools for Black children. He was an active abolitionist. His letters to the to the U.S. Congress and the state Congress on abolishing slavery are still in the government archives. He was active in the Back to Africa movement. He was active in many charitable organizations. He was a sought after character, uh, car- uh, sought after, yeah, and he was active in politics and a regular voter. He was a skilled orator, and last but not least, he was very active in his lodge. I put this little caption down at the bottom just to show and to try and get a feel for the life of times that was in existence at that time. Now, the one nice thing that Prince Hall was actually able to see slavery was abolished in Massachusetts during his lifetime in July 8th, 1783. But that was not the case in many of the states that surrounded Massachusetts. Now, the Prince Hall Masonic story begins when 15 men of color were raised in Irish Lodge number 441, attached to the 38th Regiment of Foot in Boston, March 6, 1775. Now, the legitimacy of this action is reviewed by many Masonic scholars, and there was no fault in what Irish Lodge did at that time. With the outbreak of the War of Independence, Irish Lodge number 441 was moved from the Boston area 3 months later, and these newly made Masons were left with a deputation or permit that allowed them to meet as a lodge, prayed on designated occasions, and bury their dead with Masonic funeral. But Prince Hall, as master of this group, they called themselves African Lodge, but without a legitimate charter from the Grand Lodge of England, they could not confer degrees and therefore not make any new members. Now, although the deputation document has never surfaced, in his petition to the Grand Lodge of England, Prince Hall stated that it was signed by the provincial Grand Master Rowe, and documents show that African Lodge did parade on such occasions as St. John's Day. Let's see now. I'll get this to go to the next screen. Now, without a legitimate warrant or charter from the Grand Lodge of England, the Brothers of African Lodge knew they could not raise any new members, and their only remedy was to acquire a warrant at that time from the Grand Lodge of England. Now, at the outbreak of the American War of Independence, there was virtually no communication between the American colonies in England, and it wasn't until the end of the war on September 3rd, 1783, communications were allowed to resume. Now, we do know 2 letters were sent by Prince Hall requesting assistance in acquiring a warrant from the Grand Lodge of England, one on March 2nd, 1784, and the second on June 10th, 1784. These requests for a warrant were successful, and on September 29th, 1784, a warrant was issued by the Grand Lodge of England for African Lodge 459. And we can only assume there was enough evidence and that the Grand Lodge of England to grant them this prized item as a charter from the Grand Lodge of England. Now, we could thank Prince Hall for keeping his letter book. He kept a copy of all the documentation that he sent and received from England, and those are still on archives to this day. I've ordered a copy, and unfortunately, it got delivered to my sister's house in Windsor, and due to COVID, I haven't been over there yet to get it. Now, there was some confusion in getting the payments to England, but all matters were finally resolved. And on March 10th, 1787, the warrant was delivered by Captain James Scott, brother-in-law of John Hancock. I often tell this story that, this is the only known charter to exist in the United States from the Grand Lodge of England. And, there was this very interesting story where the fire broke out in the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, and the Grand Master, T.S. Kendall, with personal injury to himself, crawled into the burning building to save this charter from complete destruction. And I also say that there was a very uh, uh, unexpected fire. There's a lot of speculation on how that fire even got started. But if you look at this charter to this day, you can see the fringes where the edges of that charter were actually burned. Now, records show that communication between African Lodge 459 and the Grand Lodge of England continued for many years, but there was no correspondence received from the Grand Lodge of England after 1796. Now, African Lodge 459 continued to send correspondence to the Grand Lodge of England until Prince Hall's death in 1806. If I can. And I don't know why. Okay. Now, it appears Prince Hall did ask the Grand Lodge of England, and this was in his terms, whether this charter would allow us to set up another lodge by the same name as our lodge. Now, there is no evidence that there was ever a reply to this question. And in 1797, Prince Hall received a letter from Peter Montrone, who lived in Philadelphia. There were 10 other brethren who were desirous of having a warrant for a lodge. And in 1797, Prince Hall set up a lodge in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Providence, Rhode Island. And it should be noted that both lodges use the same lodge name and number, African Lodge 459. I put this little excerpt in the bottom because there's often been criticism on Prince Hall setting up these other lodges. We got to understand at the time, this was not that uncommon. And especially when you consider the fact that by this time, most of the other lodges in North America had completely severed all ties with the Grand Lodge of England. Now, I put this little note down here that in 1752, Lodge Fredericksburg in the state of Virginia became a self-formed lodge. In 1757, they issued a dispensation to form another lodge in Gloucester, Virginia. The same year, they received a warrant from the Grand Lodge of Scotland, finally. And then in 1768, they issued a dispensation to form additional lodges in Virginia. Now, this was actually considered at the time not to be that unusual. And it's kind of interesting that this is also the same lodge that George Washington
Pastor
himself
Grant,
came from.
we lost your audio.
Uh-oh. Let me see if I can.
Uh-oh.
Hello?
Can you hear me now?
No, sir, we
Actually,
can't hear you.
Wait a minute.
I could hear him just fine.
Read your lips, but can't hear you. Sorry, folks. Having just a little bit of technical difficulty.
Okay, so what, you can hear me?
Still can't hear you. Perhaps you may need to drop out and come back in.
I was able to hear him just fine. What happened?
Brother
No,
Jack
can
can't
you
hear
hear?
either.
Okay, it has to be your computer, James, because I can hear him.
Oh, okay. Oh, I think you're right. I think my computer muted itself. I apologize.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
you're fine, bro. You're fine, brother Jessup. Go ahead.
Okay. Now, in December 1808, 1 year after Prince Hall's death, African Lodge 459, Boston. Oh, uh, African Lodge 459, Philadelphia, and Hiram Lodge in Providence met in a General Assembly of the craft organized African Grand Lodge. And again, I've heard people criticize this action, but this was exactly what was going on among all the other lodges in the United States after the War of Independence. There was nothing preventing lodges from getting together. And if you see in this little box that I have at the bottom, these are what we'll affectionately call the mainstream lodges, were forming grand lodges onto themselves. So what Prince Hall was doing was no different than what was going on at the same time. By 1815, there were 4 lodges set up from African Lodge 459 in the state of Pennsylvania. On December 27th, 1850, these 4 lodges came together to form a Grand Lodge. It appears that there was some infighting in the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania almost from the beginning, and by 1837, the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania split into 2 Grand Lodges. Now, these 2 Grand Lodges were set up after they were set up. They also set up lodges in New Jersey. In 1854, there were 4 lodges in New York that formed themselves into a Grand Lodge. And again, I stress that this was the practice taking place at the time. Now, this is an area that uh, I bring to our folks just so that they understand some of the things that were going on, and that this also affected what later happened and was going on in Canada. But the ongoing disputes in Pennsylvania become such a problem and concern over the uncontrolled establishment of lodges in other states that the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts called a meeting in June 1847 with delegates from the two warring Grand Lodges in Pennsylvania and among the delegates from the Grand Lodge of New York to meet in Boston with the purpose of clearing up the problems in Pennsylvania and establishing common practices between jurisdictions. Now, during several days, and it was called turbulent deliberation, several operating articles were drawn up, and the feuding Grand Lodges in Pennsylvania came together. As it turned out, the final operating articles they agreed upon created even more problems than they solved. But they agreed to set up an independent body that became known as the National Compact with the objective to promote the growth of Prince Hall Masonry, bring various Grand Lodges into closer unity, and providing means of settling jurisdictional and other disputes. Now, initially, the National Compact was supposed to be an oversight organization, but that would soon change. Now, when delegates from New York returned home, there were many in New York who were not in agreement with the articles that were agreed upon, especially those concerning the National Compact, and this eventually led to the Grand Lodge of New York splitting into two lodges, the very thing that this was supposed to try and prevent. And the National Compact was supposed to hold a role of advisor, but it evolved into one of supreme authority over all lodges that were formed under the Prince Hall family of lodges, and in effect became a national Grand Lodge. And this was without precedent in Masonic history. Now, so often happens in human history when there is an assumed authority or power without the established structure to regulate it, the power will become unwielding. The famous quote from Sir John Diablo Acton, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, the National Compact eventually claimed supreme authority over all Grand Lodges and lodges established from African Lodge 459. And the National Grand Lodge became a power unto itself. They formed Grand Lodges without the wishes of the lodges. There's one area, one jurisdiction where there were lodges that did not feel they were ready to form a Grand Lodge, but the National Grand Lodge took it upon themselves to have them create a Grand Lodge. They made Masons on site, sold special dispensations, introduced ritualistic work in the third degree that included obligation to obey the edicts of the National Grand Lodge, imposed taxes on the lodges and Grand Lodges, expelled lodges and individuals who did not follow their edicts, and did not recognize those Prince Hall Grand Lodges that were not under the National Compact. Oops, trying to get this is not seeming to. Okay, the National Grand Lodge continued for 35 years, and due to its arbitrary and arrogant conduct, its influence waned. During this time, some of the Prince Hall lodges under the National Grand Lodge became so disenchanted with the National Grand Lodge, we withdrew from the National Grand Lodge and formed their own independent Grand Lodges. The very issue the National Grand Lodge was initially created to prevent. Now, the final act occurred in 1877 when the Grand Master of the National Grand Lodge, Richard Gleaves, resigned, and the National Grand Lodge Secretary, George Levy, called for a Grand Lodge session and initially appointed himself as the Grand Master, overstepping their deputy, who was L.G. Gagans. So now there was this actual infighting within the National Grand Lodge. Now, in 1878, a meeting of the National Grand Lodge was called with 10 jurisdictions sending representatives, and it appears that many attended this meeting for the sole purpose of dissolving the National Grand Lodge once and for all. Now, a number of articles were drawn up, and since they were ratified, we know that at least two-thirds in attendance voted for the acceptance of the articles. Now, Article 10 stated, and the Grand Lodges under the National Grand Lodge and independent Grand Lodges shall solely pledge themselves to obey these articles and recommend that the National Grand Lodge do when these articles are approved by 2/3 of the Grand Lodge, wind up affairs and adjourn sendai. And that there's a Latin term that means to join without any further appointed date of resumption. Now, Article 12 also stated we further recommend that all such Grand Lodges may be located within the same jurisdictional limits as soon as possible, unite and form one Grand Lodge. Now, and this is where we run into problems because so often I get asked, why do we call ourselves PHA? Because there is an organization out there that is referred to as PHO. And in 1879, George Levery attempted to call another Grand Lodge of the National Grand Lodge in Delaware, but there were not enough Grand Lodges present to enact any official business. It appears it, that the articles drawn up the previous year were ratified and the representative from the Grand Lodges. This should have been enough to indicate that the National Grand Lodge was in fact finished. But one person of interest in attending this meeting was William D. Matthews. And 8 years later, in 1886, William D. Matthews appointed himself the new Grand Master of the National Grand Lodge and placed this appointment in the national news in the local newspaper. And by 1889, we see William D. Matthews, along with others who had been expelled and suspended by other lodges, come together in effect to form their own Masonic organization. These individuals started to form lodges throughout the United States and go by the name Prince Hall Originated, or PHO. And this organization is in existence to this very day. It should be noted that they recognize Prince Hall lodges, and this is something that we're aware of, but I bring this forward to those that are not aware of this difference between the PHA and PHO. I was talking to a brother in New York not that long ago, and I guess the PHO I don't know what the problem was, but they were in some kind of legal litigation. I understood that they already had a bill in excess of, I was told, 300,000, and they're wondering how much longer the PHO will even be in existence. Now, to understand the early history of Prince Hall Masonry in Canada, one needs to review the Black history in Canada and the United States during this time. For this presentation, I'll focus predominantly on the region what is known as Upper Canada or Canada West, which is currently Ontario, because there were a lot of folks that went into other parts of Canada and made their way to Nova Scotia. But I'm just going to focus on the area of my concern, which is now Ontario. In 1791, the first lieutenant governor appointed to Canada West was John Glebe Simcoe, who was a Freemason. He was a British Army general, and before coming to Canada territories, he had been a British member of Parliament, where he went on record as describing slavery as an offense against Christianity. Now, during this time, slavery was no stranger to Canada. Though the slave population was low, there was a steady increase in this population as the British Empire Loyalists, as they were called, migrated to Canada from the United States in a steady stream after the War of Independence, or as the British will call the Revolutionary Wars, and many brought their slaves with them. You got to understand, during this time, Canada was still under full British control. It was still a British colony. Now, Governor Simcoe at the time, became aware of a reported story of a Chloe Cooley in 1793, a young slave woman who was violently removed from Fort Erie, Canada, to be sold in the United States. It appears this incident in itself put Governor Simcoe on a mission to remove slavery from Canada West. Now, he knew he would have great opposition to abolishing slavery outright because members of the Legislative Assembly and powerful individuals were themselves slave owners. But he pushed for a compromise with the intent to remove slavery from Canada West. And on July 9th, 1793, an act was passed titled the Act to Prevent Further Introduction of Slaves and the Term of Contracts for Servitude within this province. Now, this act stated all slaves in Canada West would remain slaves, but no new slaves could be brought into Canada West. And children born to a female slave after the passage of the act would be freed at the age of 25. Therefore, anyone who was a slave entering into Canada West at this time would be considered a free man. Now, we often hear about the Abolition Act that was passed in the British Empire, but this act actually took place 41 years before slavery was abolished within the British Empire. And with the Slavery Abolition Act of August 1st, 1834, in the British Parliament. Now, sentiments in the United States were running in the opposite direction. The same year, Canada West passed the act to prevent the further introduction of slaves into Canada West, and again, that's Ontario today. The U.S. Congress enacted the first Fugitive Slave Act. Now, this act required the return of slaves who escaped to other states, even though those states had abolished slavery. Now, this act ensured those who escaped from slavery from the South were still in danger if caught anywhere in the United States. Even free men of color were in danger of being kidnapped by unscrupulous bounty hunters and taken to the slave states and forced into slavery. There were many who their sole occupation was to do nothing but try and track down escaped slaves and returning them to their quote rightful owners. And if they couldn't find the escaped slave that they're after, well, in many cases, whoever they could grab would do, and they would bring them down south. Now, from 1793, with the enacting of the Fugitive Slave Act, this left Canada West as the only viable refuge from the bounty hunters looking to return escaped slaves. From this period forward, many escaped slaves and free men of color made their way to Canada West. Many making their way to Canada West were accomplished free men who included Prince Hall Masons. Now, I often try to also tell you quite often we hear at this time that this was a lot of slaves coming up from the South and making, or other parts of the United States making their way to Canada. But it wasn't just slaves. There were members of the clergy. There were professionals. There were artisans. There were businessmen who knew that if they got to Canada, they could avoid all the problems that the bounty hunters were actually bringing into other states. Then in 1850, a new Fugitive Slave Act was passed in the United States that only strengthened the existing laws, imposed greater penalties for those enabling escaped slaves, and it was often said that this act put the United States on that slope leading to the U.S. Civil War. Now, this only increased the migration rate of slaves into Canada. Now, with the passing of the new Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 in the U.S., the migration of people of color greatly increased. They said that between 1850 and 1860, Canada saw the largest migration of Afro Americans in Canadian history. And again, as I had previously stated, too often we think of this migration as only involving escaped slaves. But there were many educated free men who, all walks of life, who were included in this migration. Now, in this map, what these arrows actually indicate is something that's known affectionately as the Underground Railway. And, it's amazing how many Masons, both black and white, were major facilitators of these escape routes to help people to get to Canada. And if you see, I put a little yellow circle around New Jersey just to show how far New Jersey is from Canada. Now, I'm just even amazed when I think back at that time, the modes of transportation that were even available, let alone for people of color trying to get to the north. Now, though many slaves escaped to Canada West prior to the American Civil War, it is often overlooked that many noble free men of color were included in this migration. They included Honorable Prince Hall Masons such as Dr. Martin Delaney, who deserves an entire presentation unto itself. Reverend Benjamin Stewart, Reverend Josiah Henson, Abraham Shadd, George Shreves, just to name a few who became celebrated citizens within the Black communities in Canada West. Now, this migration included Masons from Prince Hall lodges, and it was only natural that they would want to continue their Masonic association. It was not surprising to see Prince Hall lodges eventually set up in Canada. I make special note, all too often there's not enough Black history spoken in Canada. We have the honor of the Reverend Josiah Henson, who, often in Canada, we have a historical area called Uncle Tom's Cabin, believe it or not. It's the area where the Drew settlement was located. I've got a picture here of Josiah Henson's gravestone, and it's quite evident at the top. You can see his square and compass. But this was such an amazing man. Not only did he escape from slavery, and make his way to Canada. Through his efforts, there was large parcels of land that were set aside near the Drew settlement, which is near Dresden, Ontario today. I understand there's something like 400 acres were initially set up for people coming up to Canada that allowed them then to acquire this land for immediate farming. Now, Josiah Henson actually made it to England, I believe, 3 times. I've seen a picture that was used in the newspaper at that time that all they could do was artist renditions, but he actually had a meeting with Queen Victoria. And I understand he also had a meeting with Abraham Lincoln. And he personally knew Harriet Beecher Stowe. In fact, he had actually met with her on a number of occasions during when he was writing his book. And he wrote a book called The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, published in 1849. And it was interesting that a lot of what came out of that book went into Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. There was such an outcry from the South about that particular book that people accused her of making up these just ridiculous stories. The following year, after she came out with Uncle Tom's Cabin, she wrote another book called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she published all her reference material. And most of her reference material came from Josiah Henson and his own book. If I can get to the next slide. Oops. A record show that the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge in New Jersey, George Shreve, deputized a District Deputy Grand Master, Thomas E. Harmsley, to erect lodges in Canada. And in 1852, the first Prince Hall, and I put this Prince in quotes, lodge was established in Canada West in the city of Hamilton under the name Mount Olive No. 1. In 1853, Victoria Lodge was set up and established in St. Catharines, Ontario, and Olive Branch Lodge was set up in the city of Windsor. And it's interesting to note that all 3 lodges were constituted out of the Grand Lodge in New Jersey, which is, not a neighboring state to Ontario in any way. But there was much speculation on how it was that the Grand Lodge in New Jersey set up the first Prince Hall lodges in Canada. And it appears as a self-serving situation. The Grand Master, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in New Jersey, George Shreve's wife's parents migrated to Canada West in 1850. And then 2 years later, George Shreve followed with his family. And George Shreve was the father-in-law of Abraham D. Shadd, an active abolitionist from Delaware. I put these in because these names are very well known in Canada to this day. In fact, I went to school with a gentleman by the name of James Shreves, who's a direct descendant of George Shreves. By 1856, there were 2 lodges in Hamilton and one in St. Catharines. And August 25th, 1856, 3 lodges came together to form Widow's Son Grand Lodge under Joseph B. Adams as the first Grand Master. Now, present at this historic event was the Grand Master Paul Dryden, Deputy Grand Master John Isaac of the National Grand Lodge of New York. Now, Widow's Son Grand Lodge then became the 9th Grand Lodge of Prince Hall Masons, and it was a tradition at the time. There was supposedly a declaration of settlements that was published in the Hamilton Spectator. But talking with James Morgan earlier, we're still trying to actually track this down. And it was known that communications transpired between the lodges in Canada West and the Grand Lodge in New Jersey. But we don't know what really happened during this time, because by the time they had a convention, to commemorate the establishment of the Grand Lodge in Ontario, the meeting for the inauguration of Widow's Son, the preamble read a convention of subordinate lodges under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge in New York. So I still haven't been able to find what took place between these early days and how it was that they came under the state of New York, but that's another study unto itself. Now, Widow's grandson found itself in a precarious situation, and it was not recognized by the National Grand Lodge. That's why I brought this up earlier, because all lodges, Grand Lodges that were not under the National Compact, If they were not under the National Compact, they were virtually considered clandestine by today's definitions. Now, Widow's grandson reached out to other Grand Lodges in Canada, but as it was customary at the time, the established Grand Lodges of Canada did not recognize lodges of Prince Hall affiliation. And this left Prince Hall Widow's Grand Lodge somewhat isolated at the time. Now, it's unfortunate that many of these early records have been lost. And in fact, there was a 10-year period we're still hoping to track down of the 10 years prior to 1866, and we have lost into history at this point. Now we do know that Reverend Dr. Thomas Canard was the Grand Master during 1866. And he had mentioned many times that if slavery was ever abolished in the United States, he would return home to the United States. And before the Grand Lodge session of 1866, before that Grand Lodge session, Reverend Dr. Canard left Canada and returned formally to the United States. At the next Grand Communication, we see Reverend Benjamin Stewart sitting in the east. And from the records of that Grand Communication, Reverend Benjamin Stewart stated he was appointed and installed as the most worshipful Grand Master, and by the conclusion of that Grand Lodge, Reverend Benjamin Stewart was elected and installed as the most worshipful Grand Master. Now, I wanted to add this. I added this for people to see how perilous the times were at this time. And again, I want to special thanks to James Morgan, who sent me this information on the before mentioned Reverend Dr. Thomas Canard. And this just goes to illustrate what was happening during these dark days. Now, Reverend Dr. Canard was born into slavery in Delaware. He was eventually granted his freedom by his owners and went to be a clergyman in the BME and AME Church. And I'll explain a little bit later the differences between these. That was the American Methodist Episcopal Church and the British Methodist Episcopal Church. And he was a practicing dentist. In fact, the renowned abolitionist and Prince Hall Mason, Martin Robinson Delaney, who at a point in time also resided in Ontario, describes him as a devoted and innovative surgeon, one of the best workmen in the manufacture of artificial teeth and gums. He went on to England, where it is believed that he was granted British citizenship. And in fact, he actually went to England to get help for those black settlements that were being set up in Ontario. Again, this being under the British control, he went to England to try and get support for these crown lands to be set aside for escaping, or not even escaping, anybody who was coming up of color to give them farmland so that they could have an established presence in Ontario. Now, he went in 1864. Now, this is again 2 years before he left Canada once and for all. So he was a Prince Hall Mason. I'm not sure if in 1864 if he was at that time Grand Master in Ontario, or soon after that he became Grand Master in Ontario. He visited his birthplace in Delaware, and it was believed to visit his wife, where he was arrested for, quote, under one of the laws which disgraced the statute books of that state prohibiting colored persons from entering it. Now, this was taken out of a newspaper article at the time, and I could only surmise that there was a law that said people of color could not even enter the state of Delaware, unless, of course, they were probably a slave. He was arrested and fined $50, which is quite a sum. I think it's about $1,800 by today's money, and he was unable to pay it right then and there. He was sold into slavery, but he was bought by his former owner's brother, who helped him then leave the state. Now, in 1866, Widow's Lodge had established lodges in Hamilton, St. Catharines, London, Ingersoll, Amherstburg, and Windsor. And the lodge that was in Hamilton, having withdrawn from the Grand Lodge of New York, also was created Prince Hall Lodge there in Windsor. There was also lodges set up in Boston and in Shrewsbury, Ontario. Now, at the time when other lodges, Grand Lodges, were being settled up in Canada West, these lodges were situated. There was other lodges that were situated in London, Chatham, and Windsor. Now, because again, Widow's son was not a member of the National Compact, we find that other states were also setting up lodges in Ontario. Now, one note of Prince Hall Mason requiring special attention during these early days of Widow Son Grand Lodge is Reverend Benjamin Stewart. Prior to migrating to Canada, Benjamin Stewart was the Deputy Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in New Jersey. He was also a member of the same lodge as Grand Master George Shreve of the Grand Lodge in New Jersey. Now, we're not sure when Reverend Shreve moved to Hamilton in those early days, but it appears he was one of the early members of Mount Olive Lodge in Hamilton. And at a conference of the African Methodist Episcopal Churches, which met in 1854 at Chatham, Ontario, is Reverend Benjamin Stewart, who brought in a resolution that the Canadian Methodist Episcopal Churches be set aside of the American Methodist Episcopal Churches and be renamed the British Methodist Church. And in 1865, this resolution was adopted. In fact, I was actually raised in a BME church in Windsor, in the church hall of a BME church. So these churches are still very prominent to this very day. And it's amazing when I started doing research to see how many Prince Hall members came out of the BME and AME churches. Now, under the leadership of Reverend Benjamin Stewart, a call went out in 1872 to amalgamate all the Prince Hall lodges in the new province of Ontario. That included lodges that were set up by Prince Hall lodges from outside of Canada. And it appears they were ready to assert their independence as Canadian lodges rather than subordinate lodges of the National Grand Lodge, the National Compact. 10 lodges came together representing 3 Grand Lodges. And these lodges agreed to come together and they renamed this Grand Lodge the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of the Province of Ontario. By this time, there were lodges located in Chatham, 2 lodges in Windsor, Dresden, Buxton, Hamilton, St. Catharines, Toronto, Amherstburg, and London. And before this session was over, Benjamin Stewart was again elected to the position of Grand Master. Now, it's very interesting. I'd like to add, I had a presentation a few weeks ago to a lodge in Michigan, and the Grand Master from the we'll affectionately call the Mainstream Grand Lodge of Ontario, which is an extremely large jurisdiction. I guess he saw the title of that presentation that night, and he was on. And afterwards, during the discussion period, he recognized that we were called the Grand Lodge of Ontario. Their Grand Lodge is actually called the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario because what had happened was there was the Grand Lodge of Canada. When the provinces were set up, a group broke away to form the Grand Lodge of Quebec. And they tried to fight to get those lodges back under the Grand Lodge of Canada. By the time they realized that that was going to take place and they were going to call themselves the Grand Lodge of Ontario, we had the Prince Hall Lodges, Grand Lodge, had already taken that name. So they ended up calling themselves the only province in Canada where it's called the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario because the Prince Hall Grand Lodge already grabbed the name Grand Lodge of Ontario. Now, on June 23rd, 1875, there was a meeting called in Boston, Massachusetts, of all Prince Hall Grand Lodges in North America. And the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Ancient Free and Accepted Masons, Province of Ontario, Isaac Holder, made sure he was in attendance. And a resolution was adopted at this meeting, and in part it read, "We do advocate and recommend that the various Grand Lodges represented in this assembly, as soon as practically after its adjournment, do open Masonic correspondence among themselves, leading to a union of the craft throughout the United States and other countries," which meant now, although the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ontario was not recognized by the National Compact, this opened up the doors now for Masonic correspondence and recognition. Now, when Grand Master Isaac Holder made his way back to Ontario, his Grand Lodge was already in session. And I can only imagine it must have been a jubilant time as a result of this meeting in Boston. The recognition of the other Prince Hall Grand Lodges could be established. Now, in 1913, keeping in step with the Prince Hall Lodges in the United States, the word ancient was dropped, and the title today, in keeping in line with naming convention adopted by the descendants of African Lodge 459 and charting of lodges in the province of Quebec, the official title of this Grand Lodge is now the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge, Free and Accepted Masons of the Province of Ontario and Jurisdiction. And the and jurisdiction is because we do have lodges in the province of Quebec. And these are the lodges that we have currently still, the Prince Hall Lodge that we have under this jurisdiction. Um, Now, there are many who have questioned the legitimacy of Prince Hall Masonry over the years, and the successors of Prince Hall Masonry had to defend their fraternity against many charges that they were not legitimate. But in 1994, this was hopefully finally put to rest when the Grand Lodge of England ruled that Prince Hall Masonry was regular in origin and exemplary regularity today. And again, I often tell people to caution when they start doing research on Prince Hall Masonry to make sure that they have reliable sources. The last meeting of the Prince Hall think tank brought forward the book Black Square and Compass, and I often tell people that's a great primer to getting in to the history of Prince Hall Masonry. I think I personally have handed out over 10 copies of that book just to get people understanding the early history of Prince Hall Masonry. Well, that concludes my presentation, and I now turn it back over to the Prince Hall think tank. And again, thank you for allowing me to put on this presentation.
Thank you, sir. I know I was edified.
Wonderful.
What about you?
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. I enjoyed it. I want to say it's amazing as I was listening to the the presentation, just going into and discussing what was happening at that time, and I was telling some of my brothers in my lodge yesterday that it's so important to know where you came from so that you understand where you're going. And I was looking at the two things that stuck out to me. The first one being when you was discussing the maps and the Underground Railroad and how you circle New Jersey and who how far it is from Ontario. As I was looking at that map, I was intrigued because I think about the first Grand Master of my jurisdiction, North Carolina, Bishop James Walker Hood, who was born in Pennsylvania, and he lived off the line between Delaware and Pennsylvania, and his parents were very very active in that movement where they actually one of the safe houses in Delaware um, was actually used by or controlled by their parents, by his parents. So he was big in the movement. And then listening to the presentation and who was there at the presentation of at the establishment of Widow Son Grand Lodge, who happened to be the National Grand Master at that time, Paul Drayton, who just so happens my lodge is named after, who came to North Carolina along with Bishop Hood to establish the first four lodges here in North Carolina, which established the our most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of North Carolina. So it's funny, it's so amazing how the dots end up connecting. So very intriguing. I truly enjoyed that.
Brother Jack, if I can piggyback on that, I think past Grand Jessup mentioned something that's also really important, which was those interconnections between the Shreve family and the Shad family. I actually have a distant cousin who's like a part of that family some type of way, but with my New Jersey roots. But when you talk about Drayton and Hood, a lot of folks don't realize that they were brother-in-laws as well. So
Right.
I think at time, and I know I talk about this quite a bit. At some point in time, we're really going to have to map out some of these families as well as they're moving around and establishing lodges and churches and whatnot. I think it's really important that at some point in time we do that. Because matter of fact, I just remembered one of Abraham Shadd's sons was Grand Master for the Compact in Mississippi, if I recall correctly. So I think I put that in the book. So yeah, but definitely great job, Brother Jessup.
Well, it's kind of interesting when you were talking about. I should have mentioned even one of the other maps. There was a number of Black communities in Ontario. I had them listed with the little stars showing them in Ontario. Most of them had to be a day's journey away from the border. because bounty hunters would still try to get into Canada, and if they could grab, now totally illegal, but if they could grab somebody and get them back across that border before the authorities found out, there was nothing anybody could do once they got back into the United States. But there was a number of black communities all throughout the central part of Ontario, and they tried to stay away from those border regions as much as possible.
Oh wow! And yeah, it was a great presentation. That was amazing. Like one thing I've always I like reading the CCFC reports, and so I saw reading reports from like the 1888, 1891, and so on. I think Henry Weaver was Grand Master of Ontario, and they always basically said there was always peace and harmony in the Grand Lodge. So that means they were probably keeping something at the table. But for reading all the CCF, of course, it was always peace and harmony. There was one year that there was a law passed about canvassing for office, and said it was Masonic to try to uncanvass for office. And our Grand CCFC at the time said that was an excellent law that was made, and stuff like that should be kept out of Masonry. So it's what they always praised Ontario for the things that they were doing in their Grand Lodge.
Absolutely. But again, if I can add one more thing, I think that somebody we need to make sure we acknowledge with some of this history for sure is Sister Arlie Robbins, who wrote the history of Prince Hall Masonry in Ontario,
Yes.
1852 to 1933. And he may or may not know it yet, but I think Pastor Master Jessup is going to give us some of the history. He may have to redo it from from the 19th century to 2022. We're going to speak that into existence as well. But I did want to just really quickly shout Sister Robbins out. She's no longer in the land of the living, but this sister was really a profound Masonic historian in her own right. And a lot of folks don't know about her, but she is to date, I believe, the only sister of the Order of the Eastern Star to actually have penned an official Grand Lodge history, which I think is really important. So I think everybody should definitely get a copy of that book. I'm sure past Grand Jessup can let us know how we can get that, but we definitely have to make sure that we acknowledge really one of the unsung heroines, I think, of Prince Hall Masonry in Sister Robbins. So I just wanted to kind of make sure we didn't neglect to mention this wonderful sister. Pastor Grand Jessup, my question. I have a question for you. Did you know Sister Robbins by chance, or
I did know her personally, but the people that worked with her, there was a past Grand Master, John Robinson, out of Chatham. His wife Gwen was a past Grand Worthy Matron out of our jurisdiction. His wife went on to give speeches all over the place on Black history. I'd be talking to John and say, "Oh, Gwen just got back from New York or just got back from Philadelphia." Or she went and she was quite a historian on to her own right. But it was the Robinsons I know that had really worked hard with Arlie Robinson to finally bring that history forward for us. And it was I came in. I was fortunate that I was in the lodge, just a young Mason, just still wet behind the ears when that book came out, and we were grateful that we had that little piece of knowledge that was captured.
Absolutely. We have a lot of questions flying in the chat, and I know the panelists have questions. One thing that I think is interesting as well about your jurisdiction is that you are not the only Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Canada. Is that correct?
Right, there is a Grand Lodge in Alberta. I'm trying to track them right down right now. I'm trying to get in contact with somebody. There was only a few lodges, and I forget, and again, pardon my ignorance about which state. They actually came out of one of the northern states that butts up against Alberta. I'm trying to actually track down their CCFC to see, because right now we do not have a listing in the CCF rosters for Alberta, and I'm going to be talking to some of our older brothers who may still have numbers of people in the Grand Lodge of Alberta and try to find out what's going on over there.
Okay. Excellent,
But
excellent.
it's a fairly new Grand Lodge in retrospect.
Roger that. Brother Gum, did you want to go to audience questions?
Yeah. Let's go ahead and get some audience questions in.
No problem, no problem. So we got some. I think we got some good ones in here tonight. So we have one question that's coming in here, and I want to thank everybody in the chat for joining in with us as well. So this is an interesting one. Steve Compton wants to know: is the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ontario a part of the Conference of Grand Masters? Which I think Brother Jessup answered already, but you can answer again. And then his second question is: does Ontario confer the first 3 degrees the same as Prince Hall Grand Lodges in the United States, or do you all do any other ritual workings like the Scottish Rite, uh, red degrees as they're called, or what have you? Or,
Yeah, in fact, there's both the Scottish Rite and the York Rite in Ontario. Now there is no Knights Templar there I know of in Ontario. The We have our own Orient. The uh, the York Rite, I believe, is out of the state of New York. So the chapter that are there is out of the state of New York. Um, so we do have all the same Masonic families in Ontario. We have a shrine in Ontario that you would see anyplace else. As far as the ritual, I know I was looking at our ritual a couple times against the Grand Lodge of Michigan. They're almost identical. In fact, what had happened was we used to use EC Oriente abbreviated at one point in time. It went out of print. There was a gentleman in Michigan who has a fraternity store out of the Grand Lodge of Michigan Mainstream, and he actually went forward to try and see if he could get the rights to reprint that book. Since we couldn't get a reprint, we actually went ahead and took rituals, Prince Hall Grand Lodge rituals, created our own ritual, so we'd never again have a problem of getting hold of a ritual. One of the brothers had a manager's position at McGill University in Montreal, went to their lawyers to actually make sure we were not violating any copyright infringements by anybody. And they took a look at it and they said, virtually everything here is public, almost part of public domain. I think there was 3 little phrases that we changed, but when I look at the other rituals, Prince Hall rituals, especially around this area and in the east, they're virtually exactly the same. Now, can't say that with the Grand Lodge of on the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario. I've noticed I've had an opportunity to attend some of their degrees since we got recognition with that body, but they have slightly different working tools, and their third degree is not as flamboyant as ours, as shall I say. We had brothers come to one of our third degrees, and when we went to the repast, they were all kind of confused, like how come the brothers weren't raised yet, and they weren't prepared for what was coming after the repass. I don't say any more for anybody who is not a third degree Mason, but the our ritual is in line with all the other Prince Hall Grand Lodges that I'm aware of.
So I
and I'm
think what he was asking, Brother Jessup, as far as, and I think in so many ways you answered it, but I think to tailor the question better for those who don't understand, um, within Prince Hall and even Grand Lodge as well, the three symbolic degrees that we use are under the York Rite system.
Right.
Excuse me. And so
That's what we use.
I think
Yeah,
what he
we're under
was
the York
tailoring
Rite.
were,
Yep.
are they under the York Rite system or under the Scottish Rite system? Because
Under
we
the
know the
York Rite.
Scottish Rite system has yeah.
Yep, we're under the York Rite system.
Okay.
And that's something a lot of people in our jurisdiction weren't even aware of when I started talking to them, if they were aware of it. But yeah, we are under the York Rite.
So, and I'm quite sure that custom ritual for the jurisdiction of Ontario, I'm sure that you have at least 3 copies, one heading to Georgia, one to Maryland, and one north to North Carolina. I'm quite sure of that.
I'll get mine in Philly. I'll get
You
mine
know
in
what?
Philly.
You know what? Hey, look.
Hey,
Grab my.
I have an extra copy that I'm gonna pull out of my bookshelf. I'm gonna bring with me. Unfortunately, our grant secretary lives in Montreal, and like I said, I've only been in Ontario twice since COVID started. Ontario had put up some pretty tough restrictions. Up until April 1st, you had to have had a negative test 72 hours before going over, and you had to go online and fill out this lengthy documentation called Arrive Can. You still have to do that and put a picture of your COVID documentation, that your COVID vaccination card, and people entering, even Canadians, if they leave Ontario and want to get back into Ontario, they have to go online and fill out this Arrive Can form. And I'm surprised when I got to the border, you showed them my ID, that whole information came up on the screen. So once you put that online, it gets published into their system. So I'm going to try and get some other copies. Brother Damien, since I'll see you next week, I'll try and have a copy ready for you, sir. And believe me, I'll get the other three out as soon as I can get some copies on my own.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let's see here. Sister Jessica Fain asked a question here online. She said, do you all have any regalia differences between your jurisdiction, any major differences between your jurisdiction and the American jurisdictions, as well as, anything specific for the ladies? Any major differences that you're aware of?
No, I understand the Eastern Star is the same, but it's kind of interesting what I realized. The aprons that we use in Ontario come out of what they call Dominion Regalia, which is out of Toronto. We all have exactly the same aprons. Of course, the past master's apron has the square on it, but I did not know the significance of that apron until, was it a year or a few years ago? Netflix had a special it was on Masonry out of England, and they followed three individuals. One was just joining the lodge. I think one was becoming a worshipful master, and one was becoming a provincial grand master, which is probably something that we call a district deputy grand master. So they followed these three brothers in three separate episodes. I realized that the aprons that we use in Ontario is exactly the same aprons that they have over in England. But other than that, everything else is pretty much the same. I've been to jurisdictions where I've sat in a lodge where I've noticed 3 or 4 people got different kinds of aprons on. It was like there was no uniformity even in the aprons that they were wearing, even within a single lodge. But I know everybody in Ontario gets their aprons out of the same regalia store, and that's the same as they use in England.
Thank you so much. We have Brother Sylvain Rouillard. I hope I'm saying that correctly. He said, most excellent presentation, most worshipful Brother Jessup, and great discussion from Nova Scotia. We have 10 brothers watching your presentation at this time. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is official. We, the Prince Hall Think Tank, in collaboration with Past Grand Jessup, we're international with it, y'all. It's official.
Well, I want to say, I had done a presentation, the very first presentation in Nova Scotia. I bombed so miserably. I did not have a PowerPoint presentation. I was trying to read out of another presentation that I actually started to do an article on. I was so disappointed in that presentation. I went back that week and did a PowerPoint presentation. So I said, if I'm ever asked to do another presentation again, I'm going to try to achieve some level of perfection, Damien. I wanted to work at making it look better. And it's amazing. I've been adding to that presentation almost from the time that I started it, including the latest information I just got from you, James, that I really appreciated. It's you start reading something, it's like, I'll realize I need to add that little piece of information because it's relevant. And the more you read, it's amazing. And I always encourage people, do not stop learning your Masonic history as well as your current Masonic rituals. There's so much to be gleaned, like you said, to see from whence we came. And there's just so much information out there, and it will add much more to the enrichment of your Masonic knowledge.
Absolutely. We have to give a shout out to Brother Sylvain and most worshipful Brother George Grant, past Grand Master Grand Lodge in Nova Scotia. Great brothers. Nova Scotia.
I try to be with them any Sunday night. I'm available. I'm with their Zoom meeting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And speaking of that information, Brother Jessup, and there's no problem. Pass it on to you. I want to give a shout out to the Colored Conventions Project as well, which is where I got the information and that photo of past Grandmaster Canard. But one thing I wanted to mention about him in that situation of him being re-enslaved, Past Grandmaster Canard did not take that lying down either. We have to recognize also at that time, as you mentioned, he had British citizenship, and he actually attempted to pursue a case really before in an international court setting, and he had at least some backing from the British government, at least in the beginning, because they said, "Hey, this man is a subject of the crown, and what right do the Americans have to do this to him and put him through this whole thing?"
Mhm.
And I tried when I was at the State Department, which ended last year, but I tried to do some research in the State Department archives to try to see whatever came of that case, because he did actually try to push some legal proceedings regarding his re-enslavement in 1864. And so I think that would be a wonderful thing for us to try to track down, and maybe we can team up at some point, Brother
Absolutely.
Jessup, and maybe you fly down here or something. We'll work it out.
Sounds good.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Dave.
Also, what just thinking about the show. Normally, we've done various shows where we covered histories of Prince Hall Grand Lodges. I believe this is the first one where we had Prince Hall Grand Lodge outside of the continental United States. And so many of our members think about, when they think about Prince Hall Masonry, they just think about the U.S. and forget that there are Prince Hall Grand Lodges in Canada. And we also have Liberia, we had the Caribbean and other places. So I'm sure eventually we're gonna venture down those paths as well. But this is definitely a first for the Prince Hall think tank, and it was a really good presentation.
Absolutely. Sister Christine Hackett has a question. She says, "Brother Jessup, are you familiar with Ezekiel Cooper's history or legacy in Canada? He was an officer during the merger in Canada in 1874 and has some connections in Ontario."
I've heard that name. It's interesting that Ezekiel Cooper just flashed, some late memories up there. I'd have to go back and do some more research on it, but I can't say anything personally right off the top. But that name is very familiar. It's interesting. I'll
Very
have to go
good.
back and go through some of the meager history that I have and try and see what I can find.
Magnificent.
But
But
it's interesting. A lot of these Prince Hall Masons, after the Civil War, including a lot of the early Grand Masters, all returned to the United States. With Benjamin Stewart, he stayed in Canada. In fact, his grave marker is in a cemetery just outside of Chatham. What our Grand Lodge is attempting to do every 2 years, we have a Masonic leaf laying ceremony at his gravesite in Chatham, Ontario, just to commemorate that particular individual. I'm going to try and get some of the brothers in Ontario also interested in going up to Dresden and look at Uncle Tom's cabin. Now, when I was looking at the picture of the grave marker, I was hoping that particular area is still being well maintained, and it may need a little bit of maintenance in itself, and maybe I can get some interest in the brothers in Ontario of doing some work up in that area in honor of Josiah Henson. Like I said, he's an individual. I believe that the National Film Board of Canada, I still have to look it up, actually did a special documentary on Josiah Henson. He was such a instrumental figure in the early Canadian history that there's actual a documentary made about him by the Canadian Film Board.
absolutely. I think one of the most interesting things I've learned about your jurisdiction that a lot of folks don't know is that none other than Thomas Stringer, who was the first Grand Master of Ohio and Mississippi, after he left Ohio, he becomes Deputy Grand Master apparently of Ontario at one point under Thomas Canard. A lot of folks don't realize that, but that actually is in your Grand Lodge proceedings. So
yes, it is. Yeah,
we have a lot of work to do in other jurisdictions to try to help Ontario reconstruct its history.
Because I'd like to see again where some of these people, when they left Ontario, what influence did they bring with them in their journeys back into the United States?
Right. Absolutely. Well, Brother Gillarm, I think we're out of questions for the evening. So I'm going to turn it back over to you.
And it's also interesting that you mentioned Tommy Stringer, because when we did our show about the origins of cryptic masonry in the United States, or the origins of cryptic masonry amongst men of color, it is my belief that Thomas Stringer is the one who possessed those degrees, and somehow he obtained them in Canada and brought them to Mississippi, and then it spread throughout that way. So that, I guess that would be interesting to see all his activities while he was in Canada, because he was doing quite a few things with quite a few fraternal organizations there.
Awesome.
Hopefully you all enjoyed tonight's show. As always, we definitely thank you for your support. Personally, this has been one where we got to experience and learn about Prince Hall Masonry outside of the continental United States, and how, even though it's outside of the continental United States, we're still all connected. Be sure to just keep us keep us in your reminders as we're going to have some very interesting shows coming up. But I'm going to pass it over to past Grandmaster Jessup for his parting comments.
Well, I want to thank you most sincerely for giving me this opportunity. The people that I see on the screen, I've had so much admiration for in their research, and passing on that research to others, that I feel humbled just being on the same screen with everybody. And I just want to thank everybody that gave me this opportunity to show the Prince Hall story as it relates to Canada.
Thank you for that, most much, for sir. And we're definitely honored that you had time to out of your schedule to join us tonight. All right,
Thank you.
Brother Damien Jack.
Yes, sir. As always, Brother Jessup, thank you so much for great information that you have bestowed upon us this evening. I look forward to seeing you this weekend in Philadelphia and breaking bread with you in person. Definitely a long time coming. To Brother Caffey, who was not here. For those who don't know, his son graduated from high school today, which is why he is not here. So blessings to the Caffey family for a great accomplishment. Congratulations to his son for reaching a milestone and going forth to the next level. As always, to our audience, we thank you for giving us the most precious gift that you can ever give us, and that is your time, because that is something that you cannot get back. Thank you for your attentive ear, and just thank you for being with us each and every month. We pray that what we are doing is bringing enlightenment to Masonic community and to the world on Prince Hall Masonry and what we love is about this organization. Before I go, I know Dave has done this before, so now I'm going to do my little solicitation. So since Brother Jessup brought up past National Grandmaster Paul Drayton, who was partly responsible, very much responsible for bringing Prince Hall Masonry to North Carolina, along with our first Grandmaster, Bishop James Walker Hood. My lodge is named after Paul Drayton Lodge number 7. And this year, we are celebrating 150 years of existence. We were established September 10th, 1872. And in honor of our 150th or our subsequent centennial celebration, we have developed these challenge coins. On the front, you will see the only known illustration of Paul Drayton, and on the back is where we celebrate our 150th anniversary, 1872 to 2022. These challenge coins are $20 a piece. We do ask for an extra $5 for shipping and handling. For those who are interested in purchasing, please, you can send Cash App to capital P, capital D, Lodge 7 PHA. Once again, PD Lodge 7 PHA. And then you can send all mailing addresses to my email address, which is masonic1906@gmail.com. So for those of you who are friends with me on Facebook, please inbox me. I will give you all the information. But until next month, we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
All right, Brother James Morgan.
Brother Jack, thank you for that. I just sent you a donation as well for a coin, so I'll be looking for that in the mail. I want to just take a moment to first of all thank our guest of the hour, past Grandmaster James Jessup, my good friend. Ever since we first been in communication, it's just been like we've known each other for 20 or 30 years. And I'm really glad to not only call you a past Grandmaster of our order, a Masonic brother, but also as a friend. And I do mean that. Speaking of friends, I do want to take one quick moment, if that's all right, to just acknowledge real quick another friend of mine, Miss Gail Henson, who you all see here. Many of you may know her, many of you may not, but Miss Henson was a librarian and a professional genealogist who actually worked at the Wilbert M. Curtis Library and Museum for Prince Hall Masonry in Fort Worth, Texas. Miss Henson was a good friend of mine, and she assisted me greatly in the research for my book on Prince Hall Masonry in the Wild West. Miss Henson, unfortunately, I found out passed away. I believe it was on this past Monday. She's lended her assistance to me, and I'm sure to other brothers and sisters who've done work on Texas Masonic history. And I was very heartbroken to hear that she had passed. And so I just want to make sure that we acknowledge her. She was not a member of the Eastern Star, if I'm not mistaken, but she definitely was supportive of this organization in many ways. And so, kind of in the spirit of when I mentioned Early Robbins earlier, I want to make sure that we don't forget kind of our unsung heroines of Prince Hall Masonic history. And Miss Henson, I believe, certainly was one of them. She will be missed. Lastly, I do want to give a major shout out to Vista Lodge in San Diego, California, as well as Santa Monica Palisades Lodge and Western Knights Lodge in California. The Brothers of California flew me out to give a couple of book talks in California. I spent all this past week there, had a wonderful time. I really got to know the Pacific Coast quite well and learned quite a bit. And I even got to hang out in Hollywood and see the Tupac Museum and whatnot. So I want to give a major shout out to the brothers of the Grand Lodge of California and the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of California for being such wonderful hosts. And I look forward to seeing you all again real soon, especially once California figures out what they're doing with that $7-8 gas. Once they get that lower, I might end up staying there because I really like it there. But that gas.
You know what? While you saying that, and I was just telling my wife and some other people, it's a shame with you giving your shout out. I have to give a shout out to Worshipful Master Bobby Kilpatrick and the Brothers of Truth and Union Lodge number 594, Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Georgia in Snellville, Georgia. It was a shame. I was just there Thursday. They invited me down to give a lecture, and it was a shame how I was coming back to Charlotte and riding through Snellville and Lawrenceville and was so excited to see gas at $4.09. I drove that car over just to get gas, knowing what the price is coming back. But shout out to Worshipful Master Kilpatrick and the Brothers of Truth and Union.
Well, I hear you, brother. Now I'll tell you what was a real shame. The real shame for me was on the trip. I literally was going into the Tupac exhibit that they have down there in downtown Los Angeles, and the brother working security happened to be a Master Mason. And I walked up to him and said, "Oh, hey, brother, how you doing? You know, I'm just trying to go in." And he looked at me and says, "Hey, don't you be on Facebook doing that historical stuff with Doug Evans?" So shout out to past Master Evans, Right Worshipful Evans down there in Georgia. Brother Gillarm's predecessor is a grand historian. I was all the way in Los Angeles. Somebody knew me because I get to hang out with the Georgia boys. So that's my claim to fame. I hang out with Doug and Dave. That's my name. It must be because your names start with D. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah. Well, y'all know what time it is. If you haven't done so already, go to jamesmorgan.com, purchase your copy of The Lost Empire. Now, there's a hidden feature on this website that you all may not know about. So if you buy a signed copy of this book and enter in the discount code MIX, You would you would get a personal message from James as well. So just make sure you go to jamesmorgan.com. I didn't even know he was a Super Knicks fan like this. This is an amazing feature on his website. So go to jamesmorgan.com, buy your copy of The Lost Empire, enter your code Knicks. You'll get a special message from James.
You know what? Because I'm petty and I like funny things, this is what I'm going to do. Anybody who orders a copy of the book and sends me a note with that discount code, not only will I honor it, you'll get a personal code, but you got to do it before next Sunday. You got to do it by Friday. So by Friday, 11:59 p.m. Anybody who does that, just because I like funny stuff, I'm gonna do. And I'm petty. I will honor that. You get $5 off.
But as always, it's been a great time. We look forward to see you all next month. And as Brother Caffey would state, always remember to keep teaching Masonry in your lodges. Good night.
Good night.
Take care, everybody.